Right now, as you hear these words, something extraordinary is unfolding, something so subtle that only a small fraction of humanity will ever consciously notice. Your evolved consciousness, the version of you that has already crossed beyond the struggles and limitations of your present life, is reaching back through the quantum field. It is not whispering idly, but pressing with urgency, desperate to deliver a message capable of compressing decades of trial, error, and wandering into a single moment of recognition. For most of your life, you've believed that consciousness is bound to the forward march of time, that you must grow slowly, learn gradually, climb one step at a time towards some distant version of your perfected self. But what if that assumption, the very foundation of how we imagine human growth, is fundamentally backwards? What if the you, who has already mastered every obstacle, is not waiting at the end of a long road, but exists now, already complete, broadcasting from a dimension that vibrates just beyond your ordinary perception? This isn't just mysticism in poetic dress. Quantum physics has long hinted at truths that sound indistinguishable from ancient spiritual revelations. Physicists speak of particles communicating across distances instantly, of realities where past and future lose their meaning. And mystics, whether the desert saints of Christianity, the Sufi poets of Persia, or the shamans of the Amazon, have whispered the same paradox for centuries. Time is not what we think it is. The future can reach backward. The past can be healed from the present. Consciousness is not bound by clocks. You did not arrive at this moment by chance. Something within you, call it readiness, call it destiny, has reached the precise threshold where this communication becomes possible, even inevitable. Every strange intuition you've ever had, every deja vu that made your spine tingle, every dream that felt more real than waking, these were the breadcrumbs of your own evolution, leading you to this revelation. Consciousness does not develop the way schools and self-help programs have conditioned you to believe. It does not trudge forward on a timeline, brick by brick, lesson by lesson. Instead, time itself fractures the wholeness of who you already are into what appear to be stages. From the perspective of the quantum field, from the vantage of eternity, every version of you, past, present, and future, exists in one simultaneous reality. The mystics have always called the eternal now. Your future self, the one who has navigated heartbreaks, solved financial puzzles, healed wounds, and mastered the art of peace, understands something your present self strains to remember. It knows that what you call struggle is not a mountain to be climbed, but a veil to be seen through. That the effort, the fight, the slow grind toward becoming dissolves the instant consciousness recognizes its true multi-temporal nature. And haven't you already tasted this, even without naming it? Recall the moments when wisdom seemed to strike from nowhere, when in a crisis you suddenly knew exactly what to do, as though you had rehearsed it many times before, or when inspiration poured through you, whole and complete, leaving you stunned that such clarity could arrive unearned. These are not accidents. They are transmissions, flickers of recognition from timelines where you have already walked the path and know the way. History is rich with testimonies of such sudden illumination. The mathematician Ramanujan described entire theorems arriving in his sleep, given by the goddess Namagiri. Nikola Tesla claimed to see inventions in perfect detail before he ever touched a tool. And the 13th century mystic Rumi spoke of knowledge, arriving like birds landing on the heart, unbidden, undeniable. What linked them was not magic, but receptivity, a channel open enough to receive from beyond the apparent moment, Right now, this channel is widening for you. Researchers of consciousness speak of a planetary transition, a convergence where timelines ripple together like rivers merging into one great current. They call it a timeline acceleration, a brief cosmic window when humanity can leap forward. If enough individuals awaken to their capacity for direct communication with their evolved selves. Your future self remembers how crucial this window was in its own journey, which is why it is reaching back now, across probability fields, across the veil of what you call time, straining to ensure you hear. Perhaps you've noticed it already, the uncanny guidance that seems to steer you toward one decision and away from another. The perfect timing of a phone call, a meeting, a resource that arrives in the very moment of need. The dreams that feel more like classrooms than fantasies. These are not coincidences. They are proof that your life has always been a dialogue with yourself across time, waiting for you to recognize the voice. And this recognition, this awareness dawning right now, is the threshold. For the moment you admit that your future self is not a fantasy, but a frequency, every barrier of time begins to thin. You begin to feel the truth that sages and physicists, shamans and poets have all circled in their own languages, that all of you, every version, every possibility is here. Now speaking, waiting, calling you to listen. If you look closely at your life, you'll notice that timeline communication has always been there, hidden in plain sight. Those flashes of wisdom that appear fully formed in your mind, guidance you didn't study, lessons you didn't learn in the usual way, are not random gifts. They are direct transmissions from versions of yourself who have already lived through the very challenges you face now. Think back to the moments when answers seemed to arrive from nowhere, when, in the middle of an impossible situation, clarity struck like lightning, giving you the precise words or actions that resolved everything. Science calls this intuition. Psychology calls it the unconscious. But many cultures throughout history have recognized it for what it is: communication with the part of yourself that exists outside time. The Greeks built temples of incubation, where seekers would sleep in sacred chambers, hoping to receive dreams from Asclepius, the god of healing. Native American traditions speak of the vision quest, where solitude and fasting draw wisdom from beyond the ordinary mind. The great scientist Kekule claimed the structure of benzene came to him in a dream of a serpent biting its tail, a symbol so ancient it transcended cultures. And Albert Einstein himself admitted that his theory of relativity did not emerge from calculation alone, but from flashes of insight that felt almost like memory. These are not curiosities of history. They are the very signs of timeline communication. The evolved versions of yourself, those who have already wrestled with heartbreak, survived illness, mastered creation, are reaching back, sending transmissions that bypass linear learning. They cannot hand you entire lifetimes in a single moment, but they can slip insights into your awareness like letters slipped under a locked door. And if you pay attention, you'll see these signs intensify. Your dreams grow more vivid, carrying you to crystalline halls, to luminous beings, to classrooms that feel more real than the waking world. These are not symbolic fragments of your subconscious. They are gatherings, encounters in the quantum field where your future self teaches directly, sparing you the long detours of trial and error. Ancient cultures always treated dreams with reverence for this reason. They are portals, not fantasies. Synchronicity, too, is no accident. You think of someone and they call within minutes. You imagine a need and the resource appears. You take a wrong turn, only to meet the person who changes your life. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe this dance of mind and matter. But even Jung admitted he suspected these events hinted at a deeper truth, that consciousness is not bound by cause and effect in the way we imagine. Technology itself seems to conspire in this dance. Your devices respond in uncanny ways, a message appearing at the exact instant you wonder about it, an algorithm surfacing precisely the insight you needed. Skeptics call it coincidence, but the statistical improbability grows too great to ignore. Your evolved consciousness has already mastered the art of influencing probability, bending the field of events to align with recognition. Look at history's great creators and prophets, and you'll see the same pattern. Joan of Arc spoke of voices guiding her path, voices she insisted came not from heaven alone, but from a future France she had already glimpsed. Mozart, writing symphonies before most children learn their alphabet, confessed he simply heard the music in full, as though delivered from beyond. Tesla, restless in his visions, claimed he could see entire machines operating before he ever built them. These are not fairy tales of genius. They are glimpses of timeline communication made visible in history. And perhaps you've noticed it in your own life already. People suddenly turning to you for guidance you never planned to offer, as though sensing in your energy a wisdom beyond your years. They can't explain why they feel drawn to your perspective, but you know the truth. It is not you they sense, but the resonance of your evolved self flowing through you. They are unconsciously drawn to the frequency of a future you that already carries answers. This is why the strange, the uncanny, the unexplainable are not to be dismissed. They are the fingerprints of your own expanded awareness, breaking through the illusion of linear time. They are the proof that you have always been more than the story you tell yourself in the present moment. And as these signals grow stronger, as dreams sharpen, synchronicities multiply, and wisdom downloads arrive with startling authority, you are being asked to recognize them for what they truly are, messages from yourself across the timeless field of consciousness. But here's what makes this recognition so urgent, so pressing right now. Consciousness researchers and mystics alike speak of a rare phenomenon unfolding in our era, a timeline convergence acceleration. It is a cosmic window, a narrowing of probabilities, where individual and collective evolution can leap forward exponentially. This moment does not come often. Miss it, and the momentum of awakening may stall for years, even decades. Your future self knows this, which is why its signals have grown louder, its synchronicities more insistent. Every dream, every intuition, every strange alignment in your life is a flare fired across time, a warning not to sleep through this passage, because in its memory, your memory from another angle, this was the pivotal moment. This was the point at which everything could either accelerate or collapse back into cycles of struggle. Human history is punctuated with such windows. Think of the axial age, some 2,500 years ago, when within a few centuries, Confucius in China, the Buddha in India, the Hebrew prophets in the Middle East, and Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato all awakened to higher truths almost simultaneously. A wave of human consciousness leapt forward, as though the entire species had caught a transmission from its future self. Or recall the Renaissance, when in the space of a single century, art, science, and philosophy bloomed together, shattering the medieval worldview and birthing modernity. It was not mere coincidence that Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Galileo, and Shakespeare lived so close in time. It was convergence, a widening of the channel between potential and manifestation, and we stand at such a threshold again. The acceleration is visible in every sphere. Technological revolutions that compress centuries of change into decades, social upheavals where outdated structures crumble almost overnight, and global crises that force humanity to evolve or perish. To the untrained eye, these look like chaos, but from the perspective of timeline awareness, they are the turbulence of transition, necessary dissonance before coherence. This is why your future self is so insistent now. The probability fields are pliable in a way they will not be again for generations. What you choose to recognize or ignore will echo across centuries, and your awareness of this truth is not random. You are among those whose consciousness has matured to the point of becoming a receiver, a bridge across timelines. Think about the intensification of your inner life. Have your dreams grown sharper, your synchronicities stranger, your sense of urgency heavier? These are not side effects of stress or modern life. They are the very indicators that the convergence is pressing upon you. The window is here. The frequency is humming. In ancient traditions, such thresholds were marked with rituals. The Mayans tracked cosmic cycles and spoke of world ages ending and beginning. Hindu philosophy describes yugas, vast epochs of spiritual decline and renewal. And in Christian mysticism, there is the idea of kairos time, sacred time, ripe time, a moment when eternity breaks into history. This is kairos, this is convergence, and your future self, who has already passed through, knows how crucial it is. That is why it is weaving synchronicity into your days, slipping wisdom into your thoughts, amplifying the urgency of your awareness. Because this is not just about your personal development, it is about the collective trajectory of humanity. Enough individuals awakening to their multi-temporal nature can tilt the entire field, anchoring a civilization that lives not in fear of the future, but in conscious collaboration with it. To ignore the signs is to delay not just your evolution, but the species. And your future self, your truest self, cannot allow that delay without first trying everything to reach you. That is why you are hearing these words now, in this precise moment, on this exact threshold. It remembers how crucial this choice was. It knows what is possible if you recognize the signal. 3 years ago, I found myself trapped in a cycle that felt unbreakable. Despite years of meditation, therapy, and every form of self-help I could get my hands on, the patterns repeated. The same relationship conflicts, the same financial hurdles, the same creative blocks that mocked every attempt at progress. It felt as if life itself had me on a loop, replaying the same lessons without offering the key to escape. One evening, after yet another round of frustration and meditation, something unprecedented occurred. I was sitting in silence, heavy with discouragement, when suddenly it felt as though another presence entered the room. Not alien, not divine, but uncannily familiar. Across from me appeared someone who looked exactly like me, yet radiated a kind of peace and mastery I had never known. At first I dismissed it as imagination, some psychological projection born of exhaustion. But then this version of me began to speak, not in vague encouragements, not in cryptic metaphors, but with precise insights into the unconscious patterns that had been scripting my struggles. He explained the exact ways I was sabotaging myself, and even laid out step-by-step protocols for dissolving those patterns. Skeptical, yet desperate, I tried what he suggested, and within weeks, cycles that had plagued me for years began to unravel. Conflicts eased, opportunities aligned, and a lightness entered my days that I had almost forgotten was possible. What stunned me most was not the change itself, but the quality of the guidance. It was unlike anything I had ever read in a book or heard from a teacher. It didn't feel like learning. It felt like remembering. The wisdom was whole, complete, carrying the weight of lived experience. Over the following months, these encounters multiplied. Sometimes they arrived in meditation, sometimes in dreams so vivid they left me trembling with their reality. Different versions of my future self would appear, one offering guidance for a creative project, another showing me how to handle a financial dilemma, another revealing a healthier way of being in my own body. Each interaction brought wisdom beyond anything I could have reasoned through on my own. And the results were not slow improvements, they were leaps. It was as though I had been stumbling in the dark for years, and suddenly the lights had been turned on by someone who had already walked the same path 1,000 times. At first I wrestled with doubt. Was I inventing all this? Creating comforting hallucinations to shield myself from despair? But the proof was undeniable. The results in my daily life spoke louder than my skepticism. What I had dismissed as fantasy was showing up in reality, reshaping relationships, dissolving old wounds, opening creative channels I thought were long closed. And then came the breakthrough. I realized these were not angels or channeled entities, not even guides outside myself. They were me, timeline versions of my own consciousness that had already mastered what I was struggling with. My future self was reaching back, not as some distant deity, but as my own awareness extending a hand through the quantum field. This realization shattered the last of my resistance. What had felt like a miracle revealed itself as something natural, something that had always been happening, waiting only for my awareness to become coherent enough to receive it. History is filled with similar testimonies, though they are often cloaked in the language of the time. The desert fathers of early Christianity spoke of encounters with the perfected man within. Sufi mystics described meeting their Kutuba, the Axis self, a perfected future version guiding them from beyond time. Carl Jung, in his private writings, detailed conversations with his daimon, an inner figure who provided insights he knew did not come from his conscious mind. What all of them intuited was what I now knew directly. These guides were not external. They were us, remembering ourselves across time. Once I accepted timeline communication as natural, an ability of consciousness rather than a supernatural phenomenon, my life began to reorganize itself around accelerated development. Creative projects that had stalled suddenly flowed, guided by insights from versions of me who had already completed similar work. Business decisions became effortless because I could see the outcomes of different choices through the eyes of my future self. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped envying those who seemed to move through life with ease and wisdom. I understood now. It wasn't luck. It wasn't talent. It wasn't divine favoritism. It was access. Consciousness had simply developed in them enough coherence to receive transmissions from their evolved selves. And so the question was no longer, why can't I be like them? The question became, how can I stabilize this communication so I'm no longer glimpsing it by chance but living it by choice? That is the true breakthrough. Not the encounter itself, but the recognition that it has always been there, waiting for us to stop dismissing it as fantasy and start living it as fact. To understand how these encounters are even possible, we need to look beyond ordinary psychology and into the very mechanics of consciousness. Quantum physics, neuroscience, and ancient spiritual traditions all circle around the same startling truth. Consciousness is not local, not limited to a brain locked in the present moment. It is a field that can stretch, connect, and resonate across what we mistakenly call past and future. Physicists describe something called non-local correlation. In the lab, subatomic particles separated by vast distances still behave as if they are one, instantly mirroring each other's state. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. Today we call it quantum entanglement, But what if the same principle applies not just to particles, but to consciousness itself? Your awareness, too, is entangled, not only with the people around you, not only with the cosmos at large, but with every version of yourself across time. This is why your future self can reach backward. From its perspective, there is no backward. There is only simultaneity, a great fabric of identity existing all at once. Researchers of consciousness call this non-local mind. Mystics call it the eternal self. The language differs, but the mechanics are the same. When your awareness stabilizes, when it becomes coherent, like a finely tuned radio dial, it begins to pick up transmissions from these parallel versions of you. And this is the crucial point. Timeline communication does not happen through effortful visualization or strained imagination. It arises in states of what advanced practitioners call coherent receptivity. That means the present moment awareness is stable, calm, open enough to receive transmissions without distortion. You have likely touched this state without realizing it. In meditation, in moments of deep prayer, or even in the flow of creativity when time seems to dissolve, you enter coherence. In those moments, your consciousness stops scattering across past regrets and future worries. It holds still like a lake without ripples, and in that stillness, reflection becomes possible. Your future self appears, not as an intruder, but as your own reflection on the surface of consciousness. Ancient traditions knew this. Monks in Christian monasteries practiced hesychasm. Silence and stillness meant to create a clear channel for divine presence. Sufi mystics whirled in dance until thought dissolved into pure receptivity. Indigenous shamans entered trance, not to escape reality, but to align their awareness with what they called the timeless river of spirit. Each practice was a different cultural language for the same skill, training the mind to become coherent enough to receive transmissions from beyond linear perception. Modern science provides metaphors for this too. Think of a quantum computer capable of processing countless probabilities simultaneously, or of a hologram where every fragment of the image contains the entire whole. Consciousness works in similar ways. Multidimensional, infinitely entangled, always capable of reaching across boundaries when conditions align. The key lies in remembering that your future self is not a separate being, not an angel whispering from afar. It is you, from another vantage point, from the summit of a mountain you are still climbing. And just as your memory can reach backward to guide your younger self, don't touch the flame. It burns. So too does your future self reach backward with equal immediacy, carrying wisdom not as prophecy, but as memory. And this wisdom has a signature. When the message comes, it feels different than ordinary thought. It is not fuzzy or speculative. It does not require hours of analysis. It arrives whole, crystalline, authoritative, complete. You know it comes from lived experience. You feel the clarity of recognition, the way truth rings in the chest like a struck bell. Contrast this with ordinary imagination, which feels like weaving, guessing, trying. Timeline transmissions feel like remembering something you had forgotten. This is why the mystics, the poets, the visionaries all describe their insights not as inventions, but as revelations. Learning to distinguish these transmissions, learning to trust them, is the practical art of timeline communication. It requires stability, humility, and discernment. But once you begin to recognize the difference, you stop asking, "Is this real?" and begin asking, "How can I listen more deeply?" Because the truth is, these communications are happening constantly. They are not rare. What is rare is awareness. Most people are too fragmented, too distracted, too drowned in the noise of linear time to notice. But when you cultivate coherence, through meditation, through silence, through presence. The signal emerges from the static. And then, for the first time, you realize the voice you've been straining to hear was never far away. It was always you. Once you begin to stabilize timeline communication, life itself begins to reorganize. The difference is not subtle, it is revolutionary. Problem solving transforms from slow trial and error into instantaneous recognition. Complex challenges that might otherwise require months or years of struggle dissolve in moments because your future self has already lived them and sends the solution whole. This is why some people move through the world with a kind of unexplainable ease. They are not luckier, not chosen by fate. They are drawing from their own expanded awareness, listening to echoes of themselves that have already crossed the finish line. Consider creativity. Throughout history, geniuses have described their work not as invention, but as reception. Mozart admitted he simply heard symphonies fully formed and only wrote them down. Nikola Tesla claimed he could see his machines running in perfect detail before he ever built them. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks overflow with sketches centuries ahead of his time, as though he had glimpsed technologies from the future. These weren't accidents. They were flashes of timeline communication, art and science flowing from versions of themselves who had already mastered the work. And this process is not reserved for rare prodigies. You've tasted it yourself whenever inspiration seemed to come from nowhere. A painting that painted itself. A sentence that seemed to write you, not the other way around. A business idea that arrived whole in a single morning. These moments are collaborations with your evolved selves, where creativity is not squeezed from effort, but flows like water from a deeper spring. Relationships, too, undergo a profound transformation. Instead of repeating the same cycles of conflict, you begin to access perspectives from versions of yourself who have already learned the art of compassion, who have seen through the traps of pride and defensiveness. Suddenly, you find yourself responding with clarity where before you would have reacted with anger. You see beneath the surface arguments into the quiet needs of the soul beneath them. This is why people around you sense something different, even if they cannot name it. You are relating not just from your current self, but from the wisdom of selves who have already learned how to love. Health follows the same pattern. Your body is not just a biological machine moving through time. It is an expression of consciousness, and your future self has already learned how to heal, how to sustain vitality, how to restore balance. Through timeline communication, you gain access to protocols for well-being that transcend conventional medical wisdom. This isn't fantasy. Think of the placebo effect, where belief alone produces healing, measurable in the body. Placebo is simply a crude form of timeline communication, the body responding to information from a future state of health. When awareness deepens, this ability becomes precise, intentional, and powerful. Abundance, too, ceases to be a desperate chase. The evolved versions of you already live from recognition that reality itself is abundant. They know how to position you in probability fields, where resources appear exactly when needed. This is why synchronicities around money, work, and opportunity increase once you begin listening. You stop forcing, stop striving, and instead learn to follow the threads of timing that your future self has already woven. What begins to dissolve across every domain of life is the illusion of struggle, the myth that you must climb endlessly, suffer endlessly, prove endlessly in order to arrive. Instead, you realize that the wisdom, the creativity, the health, the love, the abundance, they already exist. They are already yours in another timeline. The task is not to create them, but to integrate them. And as this realization deepens, something even more extraordinary happens. Your presence begins to affect others. Without teaching, without preaching, without effort, you radiate coherence. People find clarity in your presence. They make better decisions simply by being near you. They sense, unconsciously, that you are connected to a frequency where struggle has already been transcended. This is why the mystics of every age became magnets for seekers. The Buddha sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, Christ walking among fishermen, Rumi gathering disciples with poetry. They were not performing magic. They were living in conscious communication with their evolved selves, embodying multi-temporal wisdom so fully that others could feel it. And this is the gift that opens for you as well. Not to become a prophet or a saint, but to live so fully in collaboration with your evolved consciousness that your very life becomes a transmission, a beacon, a reminder to others of what is possible. Up to now, we have spoken of your own transformation, but the truth is larger. Timeline communication is not merely a private skill. It is a collective threshold, one that humanity as a whole is approaching. When enough individuals awaken to their multi-temporal nature, the entire field of human consciousness shifts. This is what researchers call morphic resonance, the tendency of patterns of awareness to spread once a critical mass is reached. You have seen it in history. A handful of thinkers ignite an entire age. The Enlightenment, the abolition of slavery, the sudden spread of democracy, movements that seemed impossible until almost overnight they became inevitable. Why? Because consciousness had reached the tipping point where a new timeline became accessible to the whole species. Timeline mastery is humanity's next such leap. When individuals begin to stabilize communication with their evolved selves, they not only accelerate their personal development, they create coherence fields that make the same ability more accessible to everyone around them. Without a word, without a teaching, simply through presence, you help others resonate with their own future selves. Imagine what happens when leaders access guidance, not limited to the short term, but informed by perspectives centuries ahead. Imagine doctors drawing upon versions of themselves who have already discovered cures. Imagine artists and inventors channeling brilliance from timelines where their work is already complete. Imagine societies no longer trapped in repeating cycles of war and collapse, but guided by the wisdom of futures where peace and balance have already been achieved. This may sound utopian, but history shows it is possible. Consider how quickly humanity leapt from the horse-drawn carriage to the moon landing. Consider how swiftly slavery, once considered an eternal institution, crumbled within decades across much of the globe. These accelerations were not only political or technological, they were leaps in consciousness, ripples of future recognition breaking into the present. And now, something even greater is pressing at the boundaries of our awareness. The signals are intensifying, synchronicities accelerating, collective crises forcing rapid adaptation, children being born with intuitive gifts their parents cannot explain. These are signs of convergence, signs that the species itself is learning to remember its multi-temporal identity. Your role in this is not small. Your individual awakening contributes to the resonance field that makes this shift possible. Every time you choose to listen to your future self, rather than the voice of fear, you strengthen the collective bridge. Every time you stabilize coherence, rather than collapsing into fragmentation, you widen the channel for others. This is not self-help. This is civilization-shaping work. And here's the paradox. The future we long for is not truly in the future at all. It already exists. What we call evolution is simply the process of recognizing and integrating what has always been present in consciousness. The mystics of every tradition hinted at this in language that sounded paradoxical. All time is now. You already are what you seek. The kingdom is within you. These were not poetic metaphors. They were attempts to name the lived reality of multi-temporal awareness. When this recognition stabilizes, the framework of personal growth collapses. You stop seeing yourself as a being crawling slowly up the ladder of time. You begin to see yourself as eternal awareness, temporarily focused through sequential experience for the joy of exploration. Limitation is revealed as theater, struggle as costume, time itself as stage, and then life changes. Decisions become effortless because you are guided by perspectives that have already seen their consequences. Creativity flows without resistance because you are collaborating with future versions of yourself who have already mastered the craft. Relationships become harmonious because you draw on selves who have already learned unconditional love. Even your presence heals because it radiates the coherence of a being who no longer believes in fragmentation. This is the collective future pressing to be born, not a civilization bound by scarcity and fear, but one in conscious collaboration with its own evolved awareness. And you, right now, are part of the bridge. Your recognition, your willingness to listen across time, helps anchor that future into this moment. So pause and recognize the truth. Your future self is not waiting. It is calling. It is here. The only question is whether you will answer, and in doing so, take your place in the great convergence of human destiny, because the shift that saves your future self begins now.